Think of some of the biggest companies in the world today. There's Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, WeChat. All of them big tech with algorithms at their core. We're more than just users or customers for these businesses. We're generators of data. They need us to like them for them to be indispensable, because the more that we use them, the more data we produce. We're in the midst of a great race for data, and big tech companies are on the chase. For the past 3 years, academics Nick Couldry and Ulises Mejias have been investigating a phenomenon they call data colonialism. While the modes, scales and contexts may have changed, they say colonialism's same underlying functions of empire building, extraction and appropriation, remain.
There's a new land grab going on, but it's not land that's being grabbed, it's us. It's human life, the acquisition, the construction of data, valuable data for corporate use, out of the flow of our lives. That's the land grab going on, and that's why the word colonialism is the only word that does justice to that.
Let's think, for instance, of all the end-user license agreements or the terms of use that we read whenever we sign up for a new social media platform. And if we think about the process of being asked to agree to something that we cannot even understand, and signing away certain rights, signing away our property in this act, I think it's a very interesting parallel.
We're not for one moment saying that colonialism today with data involves the same horrific level of violence that was involved in the beginnings of colonialism. We're saying that the core of historic colonialism was the force to involve people in a massive new system, a new order, a new organization of the world economy.
At this point in history, in terms of data colonialism, we have two centers of power. We have the United States on one side and China in the other. And of course, we know the American corporations very well in terms of Google, Facebook, Amazon. Maybe we don't know the Chinese corporations very well because their reach is just beginning to expand beyond China.
For China's biggest private company, Huawei Technologies, Africa has been a gold mine of sorts. Countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, which is where I am now, have delivered some of the biggest, most rapidly growing telecom markets. Nanjala Nyabola has studied the Huawei effect here in Kenya.
They're building products, for example, that are suited to the African market. The cheapest mobile phone that you can get in various African markets is a Chinese phone.
Chinese products are all over, like every electronics, 90% of them are Chinese.
And they're building relationships with governments, they're providing infrastructure. So Huawei has provided a lot of infrastructure for surveillance in Kenya and ICT in Kenya.
We work in every country, whether it's developed, developing, or somewhere in the middle. And that's really useful for governments here. So when we're advising them on their government data centers or on the e-government services or anything else, we can share those experiences from around the world.
But the other piece of the Chinese influence is that the surreptitious one. There's a lot of questions about surreptitious data collection with technology that's coming in from China. And in some ways, it's the other side of the coin, right? There's a whole lot of data that's being taken out from African countries and from African citizens to be kept, handled, used by people who are not necessarily responsible or answerable to African people.
So Huawei does not access people's data or sell data. So I don't think that we are the kind of company that are benefiting off people's data. The only data that we're using is just to improve our products themselves, such as using artificial intelligence in our smartphones, in our network equipment, so that it can improve, be faster.
There are skeptics who would question Adam's assertion. After all, most big tech companies do exploit user data in some way. However, even if Huawei doesn't do it, there are other Chinese operations in Africa that collect and make extensive use of people's data. Here in Nairobi, the dominance of Chinese tech is undeniable. From telecommunication lines to satellite networks, right down to the phones in people's hands and the apps on those phones, Chinese companies have this market and much of the data it produces in its grasp. Transsion Holdings, for instance, sells to over 40% of the mobile market in sub-Saharan Africa. Its phones sell under the brand names Tecno, itel and Infinix. But its strategy doesn't end with the hardware. Data-driven apps like the music streaming service Boomplay and digital payment platform PalmPay add to a growing repository of data on African users and can help boost money-making opportunities for Transsion.
When you think about digital colonialism or data colonialism, I think the thing that gets lost is that the primary objective, it was about money. It was fundamentally about using power, using culture, using all these kinds of tools to impose one society on another society so that the first society could make money off of that. When you define colonialism like that, then you really start to see the resonances.
China's been investing in Africa and many parts of Asia for 20, 30 years, very systematically. It's never pretended that it's doing anything other than expanding its economic interests. It has not used civilizing rhetoric because it doesn't need to. Let's contrast that for the moment with a company like Microsoft, which talks about democratizing AI, or Facebook that is concerned to give, as it were, connection.
Connectivity can't just be a privilege for some of the rich and powerful. It needs to be something that everyone shares.
Facebook has made a big push to present itself as a benevolent force to get people online. Since 2013, the company has been leading a giant project called Internet.org, a sort of gateway to the World Wide Web for those with poor connectivity. The app that serves as the portal to Facebook's version of the internet is called Free Basics, and it's been launched in at least 60 countries, more than half of them in Africa. The idea is to provide access to select sites without data charges. In effect, it's a stripped-down version of the internet that has one very important component: guaranteed connection with Facebook and guaranteed possibilities of data extraction. Which is why, despite the company's slick marketing, not everyone is convinced that this is an entirely selfless exercise. Nanjira Sambuli is a leading digital rights advocate.
I think what's mostly interesting in what I'll call technopolitics is the rush to connect the unconnected and the rush to retain the connected in very specific platforms. A lot of these actors will do anything and everything to make sure at some point or other these users go through their platforms, because it's all about the data. It's all about how much data can I get about people so that I can sell ads, so that it can create predictive things to keep them hooked into what I'm able to offer, and therefore the wheels will keep churning.
There's no way that a lot of these tech companies would be able to behave in their home countries the way they behave in the developing world. There's no way that you would be able to roll out a project as big as Free Basics without some kind of check or balance, without some kind of ethical loop. There was no effort to even say, this is what this means, this is how this will work for you. And that is really telling, right, of what they think that African people want and or need from the internet.
Data colonialism is framed in terms of a civilizational mission.
When people are connected, we can accomplish some pretty amazing things.
Just like historical colonialism was framed as well in terms of bringing progress, bringing something that is good and beneficial for humanity.
We can get closer to the people that we care about. We can get access to new jobs and opportunities and ideas.
Our participation is expected, and our participation, we are told, is for our own good. Meanwhile, all of this extraction and capturing of data is kind of happening in the background without us realizing the true consequences.
Free Basics is just one of Facebook's many initiatives across Africa. Facebook's latest push here in Kenya is called Express Wi-Fi. The company has teamed up with local internet service providers to install Wi-Fi hotspots, like here in the Maasai town of Kitengela on the outskirts of Nairobi. Jerry Nambosier is a hairdresser who signed up as a vendor for Facebook's Express Wi-Fi. He gets a commission on every data bundle he sells. His customers say they love it.
They choose Facebook because even myself I use it, and I find that their bundles cheaper. than compared to other networks. You get the first bundles, 100 MBs for free. Yeah.
And do you find most people come back?
Yes, they do. They find it cheaper, they find it available, and the network is strong.
Express Wi-Fi has been an undeniable success here. It has made web access cheaper for people living in underserved locations.
Then there are so many people living around who are connected to the Wi-Fi.
However, for those studying the activities of Facebook and other big tech companies in Kenya, it's impossible to ignore the huge potential for data mining. Last year, Facebook was pushed to admit that it had added its own software to the Wi-Fi access points that enabled non-Facebook data, such as customer names and phone numbers, to directly flow to the corporation. While Facebook says the purpose of the software is to ensure that hotspots are functioning well, there's no clarity on just how much additional data is being collected and how that's being used.
A lot of these companies aren't African, they're not even based in Kenya, in Africa, forget Kenya alone. So what is a Kenyan citizen supposed to do when an American company uses their data, sells their data, markets it, as a product, and without their consent, without their ability to intervene, to appeal to a court system? That's kind of the gray area that we're falling into with a lot of these big, tech companies.
Facebook isn't the only big tech company playing the connectivity card here in Kenya. Last year, Alphabet, the parent company whose most famous brand is Google, signed a deal with Telecom Kenya to, quote, connect the unconnected using balloons. Yep, balloons.
Loon is a path-breaking project that's been 8 years in the making, and the idea is deceptively simple. Use high-altitude balloons to provide internet connectivity in remote and hard-to-reach parts of the world. Kenya is where Loon is making its commercial debut. I spoke with Charles Murito. He doesn't represent Loon, but its more well-known sister company, Google.
Google's mission from the get-go was to really get a lot of the Africans who are offline online, and to make sure that they get online in a more affordable and have better content as well as relevance. And the mission around Loon is to ensure that we're able to deliver connectivity to the most remote parts of the continent and around the world. So I'm proud to say that here in Kenya is the first commercial agreement between Loon, our sister company, and Telecom Kenya.
What remains to be seen is what standards of accountability there will be. Will it mean that people are restricted to only using Google-esque sites, for instance? That remains to be questioned. What data will be collected in the process of connecting people?
I put some of these questions to Charles. He made it clear he couldn't say much more about Loon. After all, he doesn't work for that company. He did tell me this though about Google's approach to data collection.
So what we do at Google is we ensure that we have employed user trust. That is something that's really important, and that users understand exactly what we're doing with the data that we have on them. We also ensure that they're able to manage and control. So transparency, ability to manage and control the data that we have on our users is really critical. And when it's so transparent, people get to enjoy the magic of Google.
Charles uses a lot of positive PR speak, especially when it comes to discussing matters relating to data. That doesn't come as a big surprise because data, ownership, access, privacy, is an incredibly sensitive legal and political issue. Across the world, governments and regulators have been looking at their data laws more and more seriously. But perhaps the most widely publicised is the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, otherwise known as GDPR, which set a global benchmark for strengthening individual rights over personal data.
That's really the discrepancy that we're seeing here, is that Western governments, Western societies have more space to keep these companies in check and to force them to abide by their local social standards than countries in other parts of the world. And that's where the colonialism label really starts to become evident. There's not enough space for ordinary African citizens to push their governments on these issues. There's not enough space for us to actually demand a different standard of treatment.
Nanjala has a point. Just take a look at the state of data regulation around the world and you'll see how stark the imbalances are. According to a study by the law firm DLA Piper, North America, Australia, much of Europe and China have what they would classify as heavy or robust regulation. For many countries across Africa, regulation ranges from moderate to zero. The Kenyan government says they're working on it, but the speed at which they are developing policies is being outstripped by the speed at which private players are revolutionising telecoms and internet connectivity.
I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with private sector actors taking a lead role, if especially, again, they have the resources and the wherewithal to be able to do this. The question is, where are states in this game to keep them in check? Because of the narrative around how any and all digital development is a positive or a net positive, asking critical questions is almost seen as being an enemy of progress, and therefore the risk is your people in the communities you serve will miss out. So because of that nuanced and problematic notion being created, very few politicians and by extension government actors want to step up to the plate to play in this game proactively.
We've come to think of our data as being within us, ready to be extracted like oil can be extracted from the earth. I certainly used to think of my data that way before I began doing research and interviews for this episode. But I've since come to realise that our lives, locations, family members, our preferences, our dislikes, all of this isn't really data until you create algorithms that can convert every single human being into a collection of bits that money can be made off of.
So this myth that somehow the oil, or they call it the data exhaust, naturally within us, which is naturally there to be used by corporations, it happens for their profit. It's an incredibly important myth to say there's nothing we can do about this, this is the way things are. But go back 20, 30, 40 years, this was not the way things were. We need to hold on to that past, to remember it, to pass on the memory of that past, in order to show that this remains the myth that is at the core of the colonial project.
We are the bodies producing the data, but we are not necessarily the ones who benefit from that. So at stake here is people's ideas, people's dreams, people's hopes, people's frustrations being used to sell other things back to them. Where do we actually get our money back?
We're not saying no tech in Africa. We're not saying, jump over Africa as you're thinking about an internet. The internet has done a lot of really good things in Africa. It's made a lot of connections possible that were not possible even 5-10 years ago. The question is, how do you mitigate the harm? How do you make sure that you protect the good and you corral the bad? The model that we have now isn't doing that. I think we should be bold enough and brave enough to go back to the drawing board and challenge ourselves to think differently about this model. Is there a better way of doing this thing? Is there a more humane way of doing this connectivity thing that we're trying to do through all of these corporations?
Thanks so much for watching episode 2 of All Hail the Algorithm. This is a 5-part series, and we're going to be covering loads of different topics, everything from their use in social services to biometrics, and next week we're going to be looking at online manipulation. So I hope you check out the rest of the series as well. A new episode will be uploaded every single Wednesday in July, or you can follow the hashtag AllHailTheAlgorithm to stay up to date.